White people often say they feel damned if they do, damned if they don't. Can you talk about what you can do? Because they say they want support for showing up to a workshop, for trying to make a difference, trying to be a part of the solution. But when they get feedback that their efforts don't meet the needs of the folk of color, indigenous folk, or aren't what other whites think they need to be, they feel criticized and don't feel their efforts are acknowledged. So I could be wrong, but this description, A, feels familiar when I was earlier in my work around being white. And when I'm fully triggered and just like, don't you all appreciate me? I can sure be in that space. I don't say it aloud, but I do think that sometimes, occasionally around folk of color. So when I'm feeling undervalued, when I'm feeling my behaviors are being critiqued and criticized, but I think I'm doing a pretty good job. So I relate to this one. Now notice what I just did. That's the first tool that I would think as particularly white facilitators, when whites talk to you offline or in the workshop or afterwards, or if it's in a work environment and you're hearing it, it's outside of a workshop, relate in. Find a time when you know what that feels like, that you've wanted the attention, appreciation, acknowledgement, reward from people of color, people and indigenous, folks that are multiracial, biracial. And then you can ask the question, what's underneath that? And for me, I think it's my fear of doing it wrong, being called racist, not knowing enough. Because tell me where I'm wrong. Feel free to, again, if you're on the video, just go ahead and start chatting. That in our privileged identities, in this case white, we're not used to being incompetent and not being the leader and in charge and having people generally appreciate what we're doing. And I mean by that, peers in privileged identities, but also folks who are peers in marginalized identities. And so if we're talking about budget or talking about developing a new program that we're pretty competent in, customer service, whatever it is, we're used to being knowledgeable. Well, when it comes to issues of race and whiteness and white supremacy in organizations, most whites, I would say 99% that I've ever met, are relatively, if not completely, almost incompetent. And so I want to remember, and would invite you to remember when you knew so little, and how for me it was like, I want to be seen as a good white, I don't want to make a mistake. And then all of that might have been fueling, well, don't you appreciate what I'm doing? Look, I tried that. I said the word white. Woohoo! I'm saying I'm a white ally. And as I'm sure folks on the phone know, when you're in a privileged identity, in this case white, our behaviors speak far louder than our words. And in fact, talking about being an ally is a clue to many folk of color that we're early in our awareness and might be dangerous to be around. I hear people of color more and more saying, that's not a label you can claim. Maybe a person of color will call you an ally, but it's your behaviors every day, every moment that'll demonstrate if you're paying attention to dynamics with a race lens, if you're analyzing policies and practices saying, how does this benefit whites? Is it meeting also similarly the needs of folks of color, folks who are indigenous, or is it creating barriers, obstacles, maybe unintended, but just below the surface we may not be thinking about? How could this policy or practice be impacting folks across race? And so, how do you encourage folks to stay in it who have low capacity of knowledge, low capacity of skill? If I put on a training hat, I want to suggest that you either do work around race and racism for everybody, and within that have some affinity spaces, caucus work, where whites can come together and do our work, which is pretty fundamental, foundational work. Whereas the folks of color, multiracial, biracial, indigenous folks, their work in affinity spaces might be much more about what are the microaggressions you're experiencing and seeing, the policies and practices that are not set up for our success. What can we do in those moments? How do we support each other? How could we speak up in those moments and have each other's back? How do we build relationships with the few whites that seem to have potential and get them to do the work so that we're not exhausted, burned out all the time? In white caucus work, whether you're doing it as a part of race and racism work for everybody, and or you do white work with just the whites at times, and then folks of color, multiracial, biracial work at other times. That work, I may do a whole webinar on this, everything from socialization. Where did we learn what it meant to be white? When did we learn that people of color had a different race? When did we learn or realize that whites around us had negative stereotypes towards folks of color and positive stereotypes towards whites? When did we realize that people of color were treated differently and negatively based on race? And so some of those early questions can get whites beginning to realize they can use these words and concepts with other whites, realize they're not alone, and begin to see the roots of some of their current stereotypes. I like to do work on microaggressions. What are some of the common things whites say, the common microaggressions that happen in meetings that are everyday dynamics, and then the more race-focused, so the content is about race. Search committee, candidate of color who clearly has equal, if not better, capacity, and someone says, I'm not sure they're a good fit, or, you know, I don't know how long they're going to stay. Do we want to invest in them? Or, you know, people of color just don't want to come to our city and our town. And so people will leave quickly. So those coded racist comments, other ones in the workplace, something like, why are they so loud? Or how come they're always together? Or she's always late. Folks of color are always under a microscope, big spotlight. Every behavior is critiqued with a race lens, whereas whites, we come in late all the time and no one says anything about us, or if they do, it has nothing to do because it's being white. So that was a brief overview of just some of the daily microaggressions in organizations outside that impact folk of color. You can have then whites talk about what are the racist beliefs and attitudes that fuel those. And then what do you do when you notice them in yourself, notice them in others? And what do you do in these kind of microaggressions? So you can also do history. If you on video, you can see my middle book back there, but I'm not racist, Tools for Well-Meaning Whites. I have a lot of material in there, what I've just highlighted, of how I do white caucuses, and then there's a way to get worksheets that have the different things I talked about. So I would do development for whites and training. The whole group needs a space to be able to talk about what are the dynamics of race and racism that impact the people we serve, that impact in the work environment, practice interrupting racist microaggressions, maybe even in mixed groups eventually. And then some practice analyzing policies and practices with a race indigenous lens. So those are some of the competencies to develop. Emotionally, I would encourage you as you're working with whites, if you're white, and maybe people of color, but it's harder, and I would have whites working with whites, to tell the whites, don't expect yourself to get it the first time, even the third, fourth, or fifth. We're on a steep learning curve, and so we're going to make mistakes. We're not going to get it right the first time. In fact, there isn't a right, but we can successively get better and get good at competencies to be able to listen deeply, see the patterns of race, understand what our colleagues of color go through that are very different than what we experience, and then get some skills in what we can do in the moment to speak up and not stay silent. And so for this series of workshops, that's what we're going to be doing. And I really encourage you to let go of this belief that you have to be perfect or you can't make a mistake, because those are white cultural values. And then I might say, tell me how you learned to tie a shoe. Because most 3-year-olds, 2-year-olds, I don't have kids, so I don't know how old, 4 or 5. It takes a lot, and they try and they don't do it. But I remember seeing kids when I was around younger people, they'd be sitting in a corner trying, and no one was hovering over them. You know, they got shown, but they just kept trying and kept trying, and then they got it. But then they might forget it and have to try it again. So find some metaphor. Learning to drive a stick shift car. Oh my goodness, the grinding of gears that I did. And there was not much that I did those first few times my dad took me out driving that he could have complimented. And so just had to be shown how to do it, coached how to do it. But then I just had to keep practicing. The parallel is not looking to people of color to teach us, not having indigenous folk be our mentors, but in fact, finding other whites one-on-one, and then maybe some peer coaching, some formal workshops, a book club with my book or other books, to realize we're on a steep learning curve, we're not very competent, and so have persistence, we have to practice, and know that we're going to come up short, And then we have to develop the willingness to not know and not have it, and then not go into white fragility. You might be familiar with Dr. Robin DiAngelo's book that came out in 2018. Other folks may have written about it. I just hear Robin's work get cited. And to realize that just like learning the budget, we didn't get it the first time. Just like learning how to do strategic planning. For some of us, it took a long time. So ask whites to really reflect. What's something you learned, but it took you a long time? There was a lot of trial and error. It was frustrating. And then what helped you stay in it? I'd start with something like that and then say, this is the same thing, except this is harder. This is individual racist dynamics, group patterns we have to pay attention to, and systemic, cultural, embedded institutional racism. And there are so many dynamics that we've not been taught. So this is a long road we're on. We're going to have patience, persistence, and we're going to practice and support each other and give each other feedback. But individually, we got to get the courage and the willingness to not know it, not be perfect, and be willing to learn for the long haul.